This was one of the most frustrating games to benchmark. Not only was it the unclear settings that affect other settings in weird ways that they don't tell you, but the crazy 1% lows I was getting that I couldn't understand what was happening until I was able to look at all the data and understand what exactly was going on. To the unlocked refresh rate not actually being an unlocked refresh rate, but locking you to your maximum refresh rate of your monitor. So for high resolution benchmarks, I had to use my editing monitor resolution, but trick it to use the refresh rate of my gaming monitor just to get some high refresh rate results for you guys. So it took way too long to do all this testing, but I finally got some good results for you guys. So let's go check them out. Let's jump in and take a look at our 3440 by 1440p results where I tested raster, full ray tracing, and since FSR and DLSS do jack all for this game, car only ray tracing, as I felt that worked quite well in Forza Horizon 5 and is a good ray tracing compromise. The raster performance sees the 4090, 7900 XTX, and the 4080 all achieve high refresh rates, though a faster CPU and a higher refresh rate monitor than I have access to could push these numbers even higher. The 4070 Ti, 7900 XT, and the 4070 all get smooth refresh rates, delivering solid gameplay. The old RTX 2080 is managing unacceptable frame rates, providing a worse than console experience. Looking at the 1% lows, we see the 4090, 7900 XTX, and 4080 all staying in smooth range above 60 FPS, with surprisingly the XTX coming out on top, besting the 4090 here. The 4070 Ti, 7900 XT, and 4070 all get acceptable 1% lows, with the 4070 being the surprise winner of this group, and the old RTX 2080's 1% lows staying in unacceptable range with its average. When looking at the 1% low deltas from the average, only our two most GPU-bound cards have a decent 1% low deltas, with all others doing rather poorly. Since several of our high-end cards are running into CPU limitation, let's turn on the full force of this game's ray tracing to see how things shake out. With full ray tracing on, the 4090 is able to pull away, but it's getting smooth refresh rates with the 4080 and 7900 XTX, which are in a dead heat. The 4070 Ti, 7900 XT, and 4070 all provide acceptable refresh rate averages. The poor old RTX 2080 is on the edge of its memory limit and has sunk into unplayable range. Checking out the ray tracing 1% lows, we see no cards manage smooth refresh rates, with the 4090, 4080, 7900 XTX, and the 4070 Ti getting acceptable performances. The 7900 XT and 4070 are in unacceptable range, and the 2080 is of course unplayable. Almost all 1% lows are improved now that we aren't hitting many CPU limited scenarios, except for the 4090, which still sees some CPU limited performance. The 7900 XT also has oddly poor 1% load, which seem to be limited by something outside of raw GPU horsepower, as it maintains nearly the same 1% low frame rate all the way through to our 5K 2K resolution. And finally, the poor RTX 2080 is really hitting some memory limits. If say maybe you don't want to see sub 60 FPS 1% lows if you're running a top tier GPU, or you want your average to be over 60F for your mid tier GPU, but you still want some ray tracing, what can you do? Well, DLSS and FSR are practically worthless in this game like they were in Forza Horizon 5, so let's take a page out of Horizon's book and ray trace like it does, and just ray trace the cars, which has the biggest impact of all the ray tracing settings. Doing this, we see a return to CPU limited performance for the 700 XTX and 4090, which are getting high refresh rates. The 4080, 4070 Ti, 700 XT, and 4070 are all getting smooth refresh rates, and even the 2080 returns to unacceptable range. The 1% lows for these settings see the 700 XTX beat the 4090. They are joined in smooth refresh rates by the 4070 Ti, but not the 4080, which is in acceptable range with the 4070. The frame variance in this game, when not mostly GPU bound, seems to be quite wild, and from a smoothness standpoint, you're better off putting yourself in a GPU bound scenario. The 7900 XT is struggling with a 1% low that has hardly changed from the full ray tracing results, despite its average frame rate significantly increasing. The old RTX 2080 is of course getting a 1% low in the unplayable range. The numbers you see here should be the worst case scenario, as the built-in benchmark runs with all 20 cars visible the whole time, and every weather and lighting effect blaring. But it still leaves no doubt that this game requires both a very fast CPU as well as a fast GPU to get high refresh rates and smooth 1% lows. Some of the key takeaways we see from these graphs is you want to dial in your settings so that you're running in a GPU bound scenario. If you're running a 700 XT, Maybe stay away from the ray tracing settings for a patch or two, until the 1% lows get fixed. This isn't the first time I've seen a split behavior between the 1% lows between the XTX and the XT. We saw the same in Liza P, and the opposite in Payday 3. The final takeaway is if your GPU has 8GB of memory, then mind your settings because you're close to the line, even with raster only settings. And FYI, the VRAM usage estimates in the menus are lower than the actual in-game usage. Stepping up to our 3840 by 1600p resolution, we see the 4090, 7900 XTX, and the 4080 nearly unchanged and still delivering high refresh rates. The 4070 Ti, the 7900 XT, and the 4070 still delivering smooth refresh rates, with the 4070s both seeing a modest hit to performance, and the 7900 XT staying virtually unchanged. Stepping up to this resolution has overwhelmed the 2080's VRAM, and we are seeing a broken gameplay experience. I'll be mostly ignoring this card going forward as all other resolutions and settings are also completely unplayable. Looking at the 1% lows, we now see only the 4090 and 7900 XTX stay in smooth range above 60 FPS, with our 4 other modern GPUs all getting acceptable performance. Now both AMD GPUs best their Nvidia rivals in the 1% lows. The 1% low deltas are still higher than I would like to see in almost all cards, due to all cards except for the 4070 operating with a CPU limit at some point in the benchmark pass. Let's see how things change once the full ray tracing is turned on. We see a fairly significant drop-off in performance for all cards, and a much better 1% load delta, now that almost everything is GPU limited. The RTX 4090, 7900 XTX, and 4080 all managed to keep 60 FPS or better averages, while the two 4070s and the 7900 XT all managed acceptable performances. The 1% lows see our top 3 cards get acceptable performance, and the other 3 get unacceptable. As for the deltas to the average, most cards are looking good, but the 4090 and 7900 XT are still over 30% down from the average, which is not great. If we want to recover some of that performance but still have some ray tracing cake, we can see what ray tracing just the cards does for the performance. We now see that the 4090, 7900 XT are the only 2 cards getting high refresh rates, with the other 4 in smooth range. When looking at the 1% lows, we see again that only the 4090 and 7900 XTX stay above 60, while the 4080, 4070 Ti, and 4070 are getting respectable, acceptable frame rates. The 7900 XT is still seeing oddly low refresh rates when RT is on, leaving it way down in an unacceptable range. As for the deltas from the average, it's more of a mixed bag, with the 7900 XTX and the 4070 Ti and the 4070 all in the 20s, while the 4090, 4080, and 7900 XT are all over 30. Here we see all of our modern cards still easily able to clear 60 FPS, and can even do it while ray tracing the cars. We see a clear failure for the 8GB card here, even without the extra demands of ray tracing. Moving on to the Super Ultrawide 5120 by 1440p resolution, we see even with the raster only results, the 4090 and 7900 XTX are now the only cards to get high refresh rates, where the 4080, 4070 Ti, 7900 XT, and the 4070 are all getting smooth frame rates above 60 FPS. For the 1% lows, the 4090 and 7900 XT are getting smooth refresh rates, while the 4080, 7900 XT, and 4070 are getting acceptable refresh rates. And the 4070 Ti is still suffering from being dropped into CPU-bound scenarios without still having the headroom to compensate, and has now dropped into unacceptable territory. When looking at the 1% load deltas from the average, only the 7900 XTX and 4070 are getting sub 38% deltas, with everything else getting subpar smoothness. Turning on full ray tracing changes everything, with now the RTX 4090 being the only card to get a smooth refresh rate, because the 4080 and 7900 XT come up shy by just 1 FPS, putting them in acceptable range with the 4070 Ti and 7900 XT, while the 4070 has slipped into unacceptable range. The 1% lows show a much tighter picture than before, though only the 4090, 4080, and 7900 XTX get acceptable frame rates, with the 4070 Ti, 7900 XT, and 4070 all in an unacceptable range. Here we see only the 7900 XT has a delta above 30%. The 4090 is getting an okay delta, while all the other cards are seeing good 1% low deltas. Now, if we want to pull back on ray tracing, by only ray tracing the cars to try and get some better frame rates, we now see the 4090 stand alone in high refresh rates, while the 7900 XTX, 4080, 4070 Ti, and 7900 XT all get smooth refresh averages. The 4070 just misses out and ends up with acceptable refresh rates.
Checking the 1% lows, we see things return to a mixed bag, with half our cards deltas above 30 and half with deltas below 30%. Though the 7900 XT is still suffering extra from the bad 1% lows that crop up when RT is turned on with this card. Even at the super ultra-wide resolution, all of our cards are still able to hit 60 FPS averages for the Raster performance, which is solid. I just wish the CPU limited behavior was more well managed. Full ray tracing sees pretty much everything become GPU bound, but also drops most of the field below 60, leaving ray tracing the cars only as the best middle ground for gaming at this resolution. At our final resolution of 5120 by 2160, we see more cards getting GPU limited at the raster setting. The RTX 4090 is now the only card with high refresh rates, while the 7900 XTX, 4080, 7900 XT, and 4070 Ti are all getting smooth refresh rates, with the 4070 dipping into an acceptable range. Looking at the 1% lows show only the 7900 XTX getting over 60 FPS, with the 4090, 4080, and 4070 Ti getting acceptable performances, while the 7900 XT and 4070 have slipped into unacceptable range. Looking at the 1% load deltas, we see the 7900 XTX and now the fully GPU bound 4070 Ti and 4070 are all getting some nice deltas from the average, whereas the 4090, 4080, and 7900 XT are all rather loose, with the 4090 in particular seeing some really big swings. Turning on full ray tracing, we see the 4090 the only card that maintains 60 FPS smooth gameplay, with the 4080 and 7900 XTX delivering acceptable performances, but the 4070 Ti, 7900 XT come up just shy and fall into unacceptable range with the 4070. When it comes to 1% lows at these settings, only the 4090 can get acceptable performance. Even the 4080 and 7900 XTX are down in unacceptable land with the 4070 Ti, 7900 XT, and 4070. When looking at the deltas, we now see the 4090 is below 30%, with the bulk of the field giving a reasonable frame rate variance, though not nearly quite as good as the XTX or the two 4070s. Now let's see if we can get some of those other cards above 60 FPS with just ray tracing the cars. With these settings, the 4090, 7900 XTX, and 4080 easily clear 60 to deliver smooth refresh rates, and the 7900 XT and the two 4070s all get acceptable performances as well. The 1% lows see the 7900 XTX get smooth refresh rates, while the 4090, 4080, and 4070 Ti all get acceptable, with the 7900 XT and 4070 lagging behind with unacceptable 1% lows. When we look at the deltas, we see the 4090 is not being pushed hard enough and is suffering from the wild swing seen when CPU limitations come in, joining the 7900 XT with having bad 1% low deviation. The RTX 4080 is bang on par for the frame rate deviation, and all the other cards are doing quite well. The raster performance allows pretty much all modern cards to play at this resolution with no problems, and despite killing off any 8GB cards early on, the 12GB cards haven't had any issues, even with full ray tracing at this resolution. Before we get into the big takeaways from this video, I just want to say thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe so you can keep getting ultrawide content like this. Also consider supporting this channel more directly by using the affiliate links in the description below or becoming a member on YouTube or on my Patreon. So what are the big takeaways? Well, first is that 8GB of memory really isn't enough. It can just get you by at 3440 by 1440 when doing rastering, but full ray tracing will even put you over the line. And forget about going higher up in resolutions. So this means that even older cards that should be able to run at higher resolutions will be limited to either 3440 by 1440 or have to turn down some texture settings to get the memory usage down. The next big thing is, if you have a powerful GPU, you have to have an equally powerful CPU. Even last generation's best gaming CPU is not enough to keep some of these powerful GPUs fed. And as soon as you hit the CPU limits, 1% lows go out the window in this game. Hopefully there'll be some patches to help with this situation where 1% lows are handled more gracefully once it becomes CPU limited. But right now, you really have to have a monster CPU if you have a monster GPU. Ray tracing in Forza Motorsport, while certainly it takes a toll, is not unduly punishing like we see in some games. And it puts the AMD cards on equal footing to their NVIDIA rivals, and even allows the 7900 XTX to outperform the 4080 when ray tracing the cars only. The 7900 XTX was the most consistent performer across all resolutions and all performance settings. Whether they be CPU bound or GPU bound, they had the best 1% low consistency across the board. The 7900 XTX might be the best GPU for this game, especially if you expect to find yourself in a CPU bound scenario at some point, even besting the RTX 4090.
The only place where the RTX 4090 can really claim to be superior is when full ray tracing is implemented. Even when ray tracing just the cars, the 7900 XTX 1% lows give it an argument for being a better GPU for this game than the 4090. Aside from some loose 1% lows when CPU bound, Forza Motorsport's overall performance is pretty good. You'll be able to hit the 60 FPS online racing cap at every resolution all the way up to 5120 by 1440p with any of our modern GPUs. Even when ray tracing the cars, only the 4070 dips below 60, but that's only to 57 FPS, which is hardly a competitive disadvantage. Aside from some weird choices with how the settings menu works, and not actually providing uncapped frame rates, you can expect a pretty good experience in Forza Motorsport from any mid-range to high-end GPU of the current generation. I use the following on-screen settings for all benchmark testing, and I ran this all on my test bench, which features a 5800X3D, a 32GB of 3200Hz CL14 memory, running on a Samsung 990 Pro SSD, running Windows 11 and using the latest AMD and Nvidia drivers. Thank you for watching. If you want to check out any of the other games I benchmark, you can check out this playlist here. Or if you want to deep dive into any of these GPUs, you can check out this one right here. Thank you, I'm Scott, and I'll catch you next time, Ultrawide fans.